There are ancient secrets being kept hidden from the world. From the eerie ruins of Garos Island, a former political prison, to the war-torn remnants of Palmyra in Syria, some of the most mysterious ruins on Earth are completely off-limits. These are mysterious ancient ruins that are forbidden to the public. Garos Island in Greece might not be on most people's vacation lists, and there's a good reason for that. The island, which sits in the Aegean Sea, has been off-limits for a long time. It wasn't always like this, though. For centuries, it was a place of exile, mainly for political prisoners. Under military rule in the 20th century, it became notorious as a site where people were sent to suffer in isolation. The island's history as a prison camp has led to it being mostly abandoned, with only a few scattered ruins still standing today. There's a lot of mystery about what's hidden there now, but the government continues to keep the island restricted. You can't just hop on a boat and explore the old prison buildings, and that's because it's not just the prison history of the island that makes it forbidden. The island is also home to a sensitive environmental area, which is why the Greek government has kept it sealed off. The ancient ruins of Palmyra in Syria were once one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire, a crossroads for trade and culture. Its huge temples and towering columns were seen as one of the world's most breathtaking sights, but nowadays, Palmyra is sorta caught up in the middle of a conflict, making it one of the most inaccessible archaeological sites on Earth. After the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, a lot of the city has been destroyed in an attempt to erase its history. As for the ruins themselves, some areas are still under the control of different military factions. The site is filled with unexploded ordnance and threats from armed groups, which means any visits have to be carefully controlled and monitored. Teotihuacan, just outside Mexico City, is one of the largest and most mysterious ancient cities ever built. Known for its massive pyramids like the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, in its prime, from around 1 to 500 CE, Teotihuacan was the largest city in the Americas. There were once 125,000 people or more living here. At some point, the city was abandoned, though. And sure, today, tourists do flock here year-round to see it, but there are certain parts of Teotihuacan that are completely off-limits to the public. And why is that? Well, the site is still a huge treasure trove of ancient artifacts, some of which are kept sealed for preservation and study. In fact, a lot of the chambers under the pyramids are inaccessible, and archaeologists are still uncovering new finds under the surface. And as if that wasn't enough, the entire city itself still has some mystery to it. No one really knows who built it or why it was abandoned around the 7th century. Some excavations are permitted, but a lot of the city is off limits, keeping its deep secrets hidden for the foreseeable future. The Madra temples are some of the oldest freestanding structures in the world, dating back to around 3600 BCE. These temples, found on the island of Malta, really show off the ancient engineering and religious practices of the people. They line up perfectly with things like the solstices. Now, parts of the site are open to visitors, but there are other parts that are strictly off limits, and that's because these temples are considered incredibly fragile. The delicate stone structures have been eroded by centuries of weather, and the constant flow of tourists puts them at risk for even more damage. People are still working to preserve what's left of the temple complex, so some areas, like certain chambers and altars, are off limits to keep them from getting damaged even more. The Gigantea temples, found on the island of Gozo, Malta, are another set of ancient megalithic structures built between 3600 and 3200 BCE. These temples predate even the Egyptian pyramids, making them some of the oldest religious sites on the planet. But what makes them even more mysterious is that some parts of the site are off limits to the public, and not just for preservation reasons. The temples were built to be part of a larger network of sacred sites, and there are still unexplored areas within the temple complex. Archaeologists have only scratched the surface of what could be hidden beneath the ground, including artifacts that could help them learn even more about the ancient people who built the structures. The island of Gozo itself is a quiet, relatively undiscovered spot, and so much of it is still off limits or carefully monitored for both historical and environmental reasons. Krak de Chevalier, a medieval fortress in Syria, is one of the most well-preserved examples of Crusader architecture in the world. This massive structure was built in the 12th century. It was an important stronghold during the Crusades. It's open to visitors again, but that hasn't always been the case. Because of the Syrian civil war, it became a difficult and dangerous place to access, and parts of it were damaged from shelling. The government recaptured it in 2014, and ever since, conservation work has been underway here. The fortress sits on top of a hill, offering this spectacular view of the surrounding landscape, and that, combined with its labyrinthine design and the towers and dungeons and beautiful courtyards, it looks like a Dungeons and Dragons castle. It's just beautiful. Even though people can come and see this place for themselves again, there are still restrictions. A lot of the fortress is still off limits to the public, with access restricted by both the Syrian government and UNESCO. Unfortunately, the political situations made it really tough to preserve the whole site, and it's still taking a hit. Up in northern Syria, there's a place known as the Dead Cities, and it really lives up to the name. These are a bunch of abandoned villages from the 1st to 7th centuries. Some of them, like Sargia and Al-Bara, are still in surprisingly good shape. You can see stone houses, churches, and old structures that have stood the test of time, but again, because of the lingering political climate in Syria, these ruins are mostly off limits. So these abandoned villages have kind of faded into the background, except for the archaeologists who still visit. In fact, some parts of the Dead Cities are so untouched, it's almost said to really feel like you're walking through history. But because it's in a conflict zone, it's not a place people can just casually visit. Pompeii, we've all heard of it. It's on a lot of people's bucket lists. The city was buried in ash when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, and because of that, it's become this grim snapshot, with the final moments of a once grand city completely frozen in time. But while it's super famous and popular with tourists, there are parts of Pompeii that you're not allowed to enter. Some areas are closed for preservation and others for safety. Those old buildings and frescoes are really fragile, and the constant stream of visitors doesn't help. There are certain spots where ongoing digs are happening as well. Yeah, archaeologists are still finding new things here. There's just so many layers of ash. Rome is like a living museum. You've got the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, the Pantheon, pretty much the world's greatest hits of ancient ruins. But what most people don't know is that there are even more ancient ruins buried under the city, tucked away in places that people like you and me aren't allowed to be. Some of these sites are restricted because they're still being dug up, and others are kept sealed up to protect some of the more fragile artifacts. For example, there's an underground area near the Roman Forum that holds the remains of old temples, but it's not something you could just walk into. You need special permission. Rome's rich history is packed under layers, making it a really fascinating place to visit, but also one where there's a lot that the average tourist will just never see. Hopefully some of the sites will be opened eventually, but for now, pictures will just have to do. Jebel Barkal is this incredible mountain and ancient site in Sudan, sitting near the Nile River. It used to be the heart of the kingdom of Napta, which was a huge empire that at one time even rivaled Egypt. The place is full of pyramids, temples, and royal tombs, but unfortunately, parts of it are totally off limits. The main temple is open to visitors, but a lot of the site is restricted because of both political issues and the delicate nature of the ruins. The thing is, there's still a lot beneath the surface that hasn't been explored yet. So even though some of the site is accessible, Jebel Barkal is still one of Africa's most mysterious spots. With all that said, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.